very full agenda today. We have a number of informational items to go through. We'll start with the approval of the meeting minutes and then have an opportunity for public comment. The one action item that we have today is the endorse amendment to the Unified Planning Work Program. And then we'll jump into the informational items where we have the first being the TIP amendment cycle D. And then we'll hear presentations on the environmental analysis related to the regional transportation plan, followed by a presentation on the social equity analysis for the regional transportation plan. Then we'll dive into some roadway safety performance target options that we've prepared for your consideration. And then a presentation on the initial results of the pairwise exercise for weighting the RTP goals, and then followed with some quick updates under the regular reports. So we do have, as I mentioned, we do have a full agenda. We'll likely go the full time until noon. Hope you can stay with us because I think there's a lot of interesting items. We have quite a list of presenters today to cover all of these topics, and so you'll see some familiar faces as well as some new faces, or not see them, but hear some new staff members today. So with that, I think we have a quorum, and so I'll turn it over to Glenn to start us with the first item.
Thanks, Sean. We'll get started with Wednesday, August 5th, 2020 Technical Coordinating Committee or Transportation Coordinating Committee meeting. The first item we have on the agenda is approval of the June 3rd, 2020 meeting minutes. So look for a motion to endorse those or approve those.
I'll make a motion.
Jim Kerr seconds.
All right, looks like we have a motion. Who made the motion?
C.J. Clark.
And a second from Jim Kerr. Any discussion on the item? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Sorry, any opposed? Thank you. With that, we'll move on to item number 2, which is public comment. So if there's anyone that would like to make a public comment at this time, please be recognized. Hearing no one for the public comments, we'll move on to item number 3, action items. The first item here is endorsement of the amendment to the fiscal year 2021 UPWP, and I will turn it back to Sean Fosler to help us with that one.
Thank you, Glenn. We've discussed at previous meetings, I think the last time was at the June meeting, updates for the Unified Planning Work Program amendment. The Unified Planning Work Program covers 2 years, federal fiscal year 2020 and 2021. And this amendment includes a couple of updates. One, to add a new regional planning study for FY 2021, the regional traffic shed impact fee analysis. And then that being coming from the MPO planning funds. And then the other updates were to add related planning activities that are being conducted by partners within the region. And so we identified a number of those planning activities that are underway or kicking off over the next fiscal year. And so we've documented those updates. The amended UPWP is posted online under public notices, and will undergo a public review and comment period over the next 2 weeks. And so today we're looking for your endorsement for adoption by the Transportation Policy Board on August 19th.
This is Doug Demasi. I'll make a motion to that effect.
All right, we have a motion. Can we have a second?
This is Josh Sudduth. I'll second the motion.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on? Hearing none, all those in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Great, thanks for that, Sean. We'll move on now to informational items. The first informational item we have is a presentation of amendments to the fiscal year 2023 TIP, and Anna Emerson will lead us in that one.
Thank you, Glenn. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to walk you through the final cycle of amendments for fiscal year 2020 here. We have 9 amendments to show you. The bulk of these, the first 7 of these, I believe, being awards that were made by TDOT through their congestion mitigation and air quality program. So those are projects being added to the TIP that have been awarded. Those are followed by a couple of modifications. So just to get started with the first amendment, this is a everyone can mute their microphone if you haven't, that would be great. Laverne will be adding their advanced traffic management system project to the TIP with the funds that are shown on the summary page in your meeting packet. This is a CMAQ award, as I mentioned. That's followed by a request from Vanderbilt to add their Vanderbilt University Move VU program project to the TIP. These are also funds awarded through the TDOT CMAQ program. Next is a request from Brentwood to add their signal system upgrades project to the TIP with the funds shown. This is funds awarded through the CMAQ program. Following that, a request from Goodlettsville for traffic flow improvements and traffic signal upgrades. This is phase 3 of a larger project that they've been working on, adding the project to the TIP with awarded CMAQ funds. Metro Nashville is requesting the addition of funds for their Nashville Connector effort. These are also funds awarded through the TDOT CMAQ program. Metro is also requesting the addition of a West End Avenue Broadway ITS communication upgrade project, also a new project being requested to be added to the TIP with CMAQ funds. And then finally, we have a request from Walk Bike Nashville for a Clean Trips to School project that was awarded through the TDOT CMAQ program. This is also a new project being added to the TIP. And then we're moving into a request from Gallatin for their existing east-west connector. This is their Albert Gallatin Avenue and Hatton Track Road extension project. They've been working on this project for quite some time, working through getting construction finished up. They made a request to us for additional funds for a construction overrun that they've encountered, and as I think most people will remember, we recently added highway improvement program funds that the MPO received to the TIP, and we are going to grant that cost overrun to Gallatin, as this is an existing project in the TIP and falls under both eligibility for those funds and the resolution that we passed as an MPO for use of those funds. And then finally, we have a request from Murfreesboro for their Cherry Lane extension project. It includes an interchange with I-840. We are programming construction reserve funds for this project, as well as adding a portion of funding from Murfreesboro's currently unprogrammed balance for a right-of-way overrun that they have experienced. And if anyone has any questions at all about any of these proposed amendments, I'm certainly happy to answer those before I hand it back to Glenn.
Hey, Anna, this is Jim Kerr. I had a question about the Laverne traffic management system, and this is just out of curiosity, how is it integrating with the I-24 Smart Corridor project? And I'm not sure if anyone can answer that, but I was just wondering how that was going to tie together.
I do remember in reviewing their CMAQ application that they noted that it's definitely, intending to tie in with that system. I think Smyrna has a similar effort going on with upgrades that are intended to help enhance the overall operation of the Smart Corridor. If anyone is on the line with us from Laverne and wants to speak more to the details of that project, you're certainly welcome to. And if not, Jim, we can certainly get more information on that for you, just so you can read more about what's going on with this project.
Thank you.
Sure. Do we have any other questions before I hand it back to Glenn? If not, we'll turn it over for the endorsement.
This is Keith Free. I'll make a motion if that's appropriate to endorse this.
This is Jonathan Marston. I'll second.
Oh, sorry. I think this item doesn't require an endorsement today, just an informational item.
Thanks, Sean. That's me being used to the old ways.
So if there's no comments on that one, I think we can move to the next item. I hope we didn't lose Glenn there.
Hey, Sean, can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, I was muted and talking away. So thanks for filling us in on that, Anna. And since we have no further questions, we'll move on to the next informational item, which is environmental quality and social equity analysis for the regional transportation plan. And it looks like Ben Gramling will start us off on that one.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. Happy to be here with you this morning to present some of the core elements of a policy brief on environmental issues and trends that we are drafting to inform the ongoing development of the regional transportation plan. Sean, if you want to move to the next slide. We've got a lot of information to get through with this and the following agenda items, so I hope to move fairly quickly through this. This shows an outline of the policy brief as it stands today, and most of the slides this morning generally follow this overall flow as well. We'll be taking questions. I hope to have a minute or two at the end of this series of slides on this policy brief to field questions if there are any, but also if you have any interest in digging deeper into anything we're presenting this morning, I'd be happy to follow up with any of you offline after today's meeting. Why this topic matters to us is in part because there are federal expectations embedded in the FAST Act of 2015 to address national goals and planning factors that focus on environmental sustainability and reduce project delays that generally tie out to environmental phases of the project development process. But there's also increasing focus on planning for, building for, and maintaining system resiliency, especially in light of increased extreme weather events. And there's also been increased attention and resources dedicated towards the concept of planning and environmental linkages, or PEL work. And I'll talk a little bit more about our PEL approach in the next slide, but it is also worth pointing out, although it's obvious to everyone, I'm sure, that our region's economy is founded on abundant access to abundant and high quality natural resources. Our quality of life in homes and neighborhoods across our region depend on access to those same resources in order to support families' economic, physical, and emotional well-being. And it's also important, I think, to point out to you all that there's a strong desire at GNRC to expand the usefulness of our planning process and our work products. And the environmental planning arena is one area where we've invested considerable time and effort over the course of the last year to really expand and strengthen the way in which our planning work can interact with and enhance decision-making that affects environmental conditions across the region. In moving to the next slide, we developed earlier this year a diagram that is intended to simplify the often complex and dynamic interaction between transportation projects and the transportation planning process and the environments within which those actions take place. On the right-hand side of this graphic, we see that transportation projects have a direct impact on environmental conditions. There are things in the environment that may be harmed as a transportation investment moves forward. And within GNRC's RTP context, we refer to those issues as environmental conflicts. On the left-hand side of the graphic, we're also illustrating that environmental conditions can have impacts on transportation projects and the transportation planning process itself. Those are environmental factors that may increase the complexity of a project, things like a floodplain boundary or steep slopes or enhanced permitting requirements that may add to the complexity of the design or engineering or construction of a project or increase cost of a project. And over the past year and a half, our work has been focused on understanding as best as we can current environmental conditions, how they may impact or be impacted by transportation projects, and importantly, broader regional growth trends. And then we've also been developing an approach to analyzing projects, and you all will hear more about that and participate in that approach as we move further in the transportation planning process tied to this specific RTP cycle. It's also important to note that moving forward, our work is likely to involve in enhanced sharing of environmental information across a broader range of stakeholders so that more and better information about this particular dynamic shown on this slide is better understood as early in the process of a project as possible. Next slide, Sean. For today, we have four major categories of information of environmental issues to present to you: air, water, land, and sociocultural resources. And it's important to note that a number of these issues are implicated very directly during the project delivery process. And typically that happens during the environmental phase or the development of environmental documents and working through the NEPA process. There is a lot of underlying data and analysis that sits behind the information that we're planning to show to you on the following slides. And we hope that we're bringing forward the most salient and important information to you. We gathered many of these data sets by interacting with other agencies. So most of the data that we're showing you this morning has been provided by other agencies and aggregated and analyzed by our research team at GNRC. And I also want to point out that much of this information and the work overall has been informed by members of GNRC's Regional Environmental Roundtable that has met several times since spring of this year and is scheduled to meet again next week, Wednesday. Jumping into the environmental resources themselves, you all are probably aware that our region in its entirety falls into an attainment category by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency when it comes to national ambient air quality standards. But this map shows the distribution of ambient air quality monitoring locations across our 7-county region, which collect information on a regular basis on ozone, small particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and NOx pollutant constituents. We also pulled together a graphic that shows 20-year historical data of air quality index measurements, which is essentially an aggregate of those different air quality constituents that are monitored through the stations that were shown on the previous slide. The gray background shows that 20-year historical high and low AQI value for each calendar date over the course of the last 20 years. And you'll see that a fairly common seasonal fluctuation where air quality index values generally increase over the course of the middle months of the year. What we're seeing here in the colored trend line is data for the current calendar year to date, which of course jumps out at us very quickly is the fact that COVID-related quarantine and stay-at-home orders are likely having that very significant impact on AQI values across our region and keeping our overall high and low values on a day-to-day basis towards the bottom of the overall trend line over the course of the last 20 years. In transitioning to water resources, we want to show some of the data that you've all seen previously, but in the context of our region's water resources. So this graphic shows the overall 7-county region, the nearly 4,000 square miles of the MPO boundary distributed against the 3 major watershed systems in our region, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, and the Green River. And not surprisingly, what we see is that a vast majority of our region drains into and through the Cumberland River, 78% of our 4,000 square miles. About 18% of our landmass drains ultimately into the lower Tennessee, and then 4% drains the northeastern corner of our region, drains through the Barren River, which ultimately empties into Kentucky's Green River and out into the Ohio. Next slide shows our population distribution against each of those watersheds. Also, 90%, 91% of our region's population in 2017 resided within the Cumberland River watershed. Much smaller percentage reside within the Tennessee River watershed, and then only 1% in that northeastern corner that ultimately reside in the Barren River watershed, which again empties into the Green River of Kentucky. And then the development pattern that you've seen previously as of 2017 follows that same trend, where a vast majority of developed parcels across our 7-county region exist or are sited within the Cumberland River corridor. We've developed a characterization of current land type on the next slide, which describes the type of development that currently occurs as of 2017 on each parcel across the region. And we classified or developed 6 different classifications: high, medium, and low density development, undeveloped lands, open water, and then an aggregate of public right-of-way and other land types. And the key data point to highlight here on this particular slide is that as of 2017, 72% of our 7-county landmass remained in an undeveloped condition. Jumping to the next slide, which shows impervious surfaces across that 7-county region as of 2017, there were a total of 252 square miles of impervious surfaces. And just like the population and development and land use or land type trends that we showed on previous slides, this slide carries that same trend forward, where a vast majority of impervious surfaces across the region are situated within the Cumberland River watershed. Looking more closely at the water resource itself, what we have focused on at GNRC as part of this process is on the physical condition and extent of water, surface water bodies across the 7-county region, and we focused on the water quality conditions found within those surface water bodies. And as you might know, the alteration of surface water bodies is regulated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the state's Department of Environment and Conservation. And water quality is really driven by the Federal Clean Water Act and regulated at the state level also by TDEC. And while I don't want to jump too far into the weeds on aspects of the Federal Clean Water Act, I want to point out that when it comes to water quality at GNRC, as it relates to this planning process, we've decided to focus on waters that have been assessed by the state's Department of Environment and Conservation and determined to be either threatened or impaired in comparison to their designated use. And we focused on impairments that are the result of a subset of water quality parameters that generally are associated with transportation projects and or land uses that are linked to transportation infrastructure. I've got another slide a little bit later on that shows the distribution of impaired waters. We'll talk a little bit more about what that all means, but I wanted to spend a moment to lay out that framework of physical characterization of the extent of surface water bodies and then water quality conditions within each of those water bodies. So the next slide shows the distribution of wetlands across our 7-county region. In 2020, we are showing a total of 26,800 acres of wetlands. We see those distributed mostly within forested wetlands and wetland ponds. And then a much smaller percentage are freshwater emergent wetlands, which are essentially areas that are riparian or adjacent to streams or rivers that are a transitional stage between the surface water body and upland and dry terrestrial land on the other side. The next slide shows that distribution of impaired waters that I mentioned a moment ago. And across the 7-county region, TDEC has assessed, pursuant to the Clean Water Act, a total of just over 5,000 linear miles of rivers and streams. And you can probably make out the very faint blue that is in the background, the blue stream segments that are in the background of this graphic. Those are areas that are included in that 5,000 mile total. What we've brought forward in both the red and the maroon colors are the percentages of those total stream miles in the MPO boundary that have been determined by TDEC to be impaired or threatened. And in total across the region, nearly 30% of our region stream miles have been classified as impaired or threatened, and 17% of those stream miles have been characterized as threatened or impaired, again, due to that subset of water quality parameters that generally tie out to transportation projects or land uses that are closely associated with transportation infrastructure. The next slide transitions to a brief discussion about flood risk. I'm sure you're all familiar with what's at stake when it comes to flood risk across our region. I'm sure many of you personally have experienced some direct impact of flooding in the past. Human life, property value, and importantly for the exercise of updating our regional transportation plan, we are keenly interested in the ongoing performance and resilience of transportation infrastructure in response to increased extreme weather events and other events that may have some impact on our transportation infrastructure. And also wanted to just point out that the way that we've been looking at flood risk as part of this analysis is through the lens of the National Flood Insurance Program, which is just one framework to describe flood risk for a region. And when delineating formal floodplain boundaries that are used by FEMA as part of the flood insurance program to set flood insurance rates, it's helpful to just remind people that in some circumstances, a floodplain may capture the entirety of a particular parcel, which is illustrated by the white box in the image at the top right, which is a screenshot captured from our region. And in other circumstances, there may only be a portion of a property that falls into the formal federally delineated floodplain. In either circumstance, it's important to point out that the function and value of those properties is significantly limited, as well as they're put at significant risk to impact as a result of future flood events. We've gone forward and calculated the number of properties and total assessed value of properties that fall within the 100-year floodplain and 500-year floodplain across the entire region. It's, of course, hard to pick out any valuable detail from the actual floodplain geographic extent other than to see that it's widely distributed across the region. But the data points shown on the left of the map really highlight the value that's at risk. So within the 100-year floodplain, we have totaled just over 18,000 properties that comprise a total assessed value for structure and land of $2.9 billion. The 500-year floodplain includes an additional nearly 6,900 properties valued at an additional $2.8 billion of assessed value. That is no small total value there. Transitioning to more land-based environmental assets, we've worked with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency to obtain and evaluate data from their most recent state wildlife action plan. This map shows a subset of priority habitat across the region: aquatic upstream, terrestrial, and subterranean habitat is generally how TWRA classifies their habitat types. It's important to point out that each of those habitat types can, in certain circumstances, overlap one another. This map is showing an aggregate of all high and very high priority habitats that are identified by TWRA as important conservation priorities for the state and the region. The next slide shows our calculations for canopy coverage across the region, which we have grouped into 4 different ranges, from low density, moderately low, moderately high, and high density. And we see a fairly decent distribution across those 4 ranges, and fairly decent distribution across geographically across the entire 7-county region. The next slide shows our calculation of prime agricultural soils, which is a soil classification determined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we see that nearly a third of our 7-county region has prime agricultural soils on them, a total of more than 778,000 acres. And we also thought it would be helpful to map the location of the region's 33 century farms, which you might know is a designation that acknowledges farms that have been in continual family ownership for at least 100 years. Lastly, we have a map that shows the distribution of sociocultural resources across the region. And we see that there are a pretty wide distribution of historic sites and districts, parks and recreation, religious institutions, and academic institutions. You might pick up on a slightly higher concentration in Davidson, Williamson, and Rutherford counties. And I'll also just point out that the policy brief will also speak to 2 additional sociocultural resources that we aren't able to map, which are archaeological sites and burial sites and cemeteries. So that is the brief characterization of current environmental conditions that we wanted to put in front of you. And as we think about how those environmental resources may change into the future, we think about threats and risk factors. And for the purposes of our regional transportation plan, we've identified these 4 threats and risk factors to focus on going forward. For the purposes of today's presentation, we're going to focus on the first 2, population growth and development patterns, in large part because it tracks very closely with information and discussion that you all have engaged in over the course of a series of meetings. I do want to point out that the policy brief will also take up discussion on potential policy and regulatory changes, as well as issues around climate uncertainty. So you can look for information on those 2 important threats and risk factors in the policy brief itself as it's shared later in this process. So if we move to the next slide, this is again information that you have seen previously. It's the distribution of developed parcels projected out to 2045. Compared to that graphic we shared earlier in this slide deck, we see a 13% increase in the number of parcels to a total of 557,000 parcels across the 7-county region as of 2045. And it's important to just point out that generally speaking, the distribution of increase in developed parcels generally stays consistent with the pattern, the watershed-based pattern that we pointed out earlier in this slide deck. We jump to the next slide, we see population density projected to 2045 across the same watershed boundaries, generally still following that same trend of most of the growth of population occurring within the Cumberland River corridor, Cumberland River watershed. And then lastly, we also projected out development patterns to 2045 to see if we could pick up on discernible patterns of land type changes between 2017 and 2045. And what I would point out here on this slide, there's again a lot of information on this slide, but what I'd point out, and this is also summarized in a table a little bit later in the presentation, but we're projecting that land type changes will bring a decrease by 26% in the amount of undeveloped parcels that are out there across the 7-county region. So if we then take our understanding of the current environment, plug in our characterization of threats and risk factors, then we're able to start to think through what that means in terms of key findings and implications for the long-range transportation planning process. And again, to refer back to this graphic that we showed earlier, we're really working to understand over the course of time, over the course of 25 years, what might we expect to see in terms of changes in the relationship between transportation planning and project development and environmental conditions. And it's hard to decouple transportation and project development, as you all know, from population growth and development growth as well. So what we see and what we'll illustrate on the next series of slides is that we are really expecting to see a significant potential for increased environmental conflicts, potential for increased environmental challenges, which then is likely to increase project complexity and potentially cost. And I think it's also fair to think that there could be increased chance for environmental controversy as well. The next slides will hopefully help to show the potential scale of that impact. So when we at GNRC, as part of the RTP update process, will be evaluating projects, we will aggregate many of the data sets that we've looked at this morning and look at them in the context of one composite layer we refer to as environmentally sensitive areas. That's what's shown in green on this particular slide. The component environmental factors or data layers that comprise our ESA layer are shown on the slide at right. And when we take them all together, including overlap that does exist, we see that 2,400 square miles of our 7-county region is implicated by environmentally sensitive areas, meaning that there's some environmental factor present on 62% of our region. Moving to the next slide, recall that environmental challenges are in part a subset of our ESA, and that they are environmental factors that increase the complexity of a transportation project. And those factors are also identified on the right-hand side of this slide. And what we see when we take them all together is that 555 square miles of our 7-county region is implicated in our challenges layer, which is 14% of our region's total land mass. The next slide shows an additional set of environmental factors, and this is new for our work in this plan update cycle. We've chosen to add kind of a secondary set of environmental factors that will enhance our environmental analysis. They include several data sets from new collaborators like the Nature Conservancy and the Land Trust for Tennessee. And altogether, these additional environmental factors we feel will really put us in a position to improve the way in which we're evaluating projects and the environment and the dynamic relationships between the two of them. So then we can combine all of that together, the ESA layer and the additional environmental factors. And what we see when we take those two data sets together is that we see a slight increase in the total landmass of our region that is implicated by environmental considerations. So about 2/3 of our region, 68% of our region, has something present from an environmental perspective that will need to be taken into account, either because it may be impacted by a potential transportation investment or because that environmental feature may have a direct impact on that project as it moves forward.
What specific item are the delineated green circles? I mean, they're pretty obvious when you go back one slide. You can see them on this slide too. But what specific element are they representing? Because that's an odd feature
so
geographically.
Max Baker can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that those circles are approximate locations of rare or endangered species records. And so they're represented as a larger geography than that specific point where they may have been observed in order to protect them from either intended or unintended harm.
Okay. The rest of the features seem to be more following a natural feature or a parkland or something like that, but those were clearly circular, so I was just curious what specifically that was. That looked man-made, not natural.
Yep.
Thank you.
You may also be able to pick up on it's hard on this particular graphic, but you may pick up on other polygons that have straight lines bounding them, which may be a specific parcel, that may be a conserved property, or it may be a historic district that is larger than a specific parcel. So there are some unique physical attributes to some of these layers. Thanks for asking that question. So what we can do now with this kind of composite understanding of where there are environmental factors that we need to take into consideration is we can compare them to where development currently is and where we are projecting to see development over the course of the plan horizon. So we take that environmentally sensitive areas layer, lay it against the developed parcels as of 2017, and we see that there are 626 square miles of overlap. So 26% of our ESA is conceptually being threatened by current development. We can project that out to 2045 or see what that looks like with the projection to 2045. And on the next slide, we see that the overlap between the projected development to 2045 and the ESA as we currently have it defined increases to 71% of the ESA boundary. So there is an increase of over 1,000 square miles of environmentally sensitive areas that could be impacted or threatened by development that we're projecting to take place between now and 2045. We have on the next slide a table that shows a lot of information regarding the projected changes to land type. And rather than jumping into any detail on this, I would just point out that in the undeveloped row, second row from bottom, we're projecting that there could be a total of 743 square miles of undeveloped land that transitions to a developed condition. Now there's an asterisk there because we don't know exactly what kind of development that is. That doesn't necessarily mean that all 743 square miles today is in a more natural state and all of that land will be under roof or under road. But we describe it as area that is under threat given the projections of development that we've showed to you in previous meetings and have again showed to you today. The next slide shows potential environmental impacts. So 2017 or baseline conditions projected out to 2045, the overlap that we pointed out previously of projected development and the environmentally sensitive areas layer shows an increase of more than 1,000 square miles of land that becomes potentially threatened by new development over that 25-year time period. Additional environmental factors sees an increase of 398 square miles that are threatened, and challenges see an increase in overlap of 216 square miles. High value canopy sees a potential significant impact as well. Now, these are projected potential environmental impacts. I want to again qualify that because we don't have as detailed of an understanding of what development will occur where and how exactly that may interface with the environmental resources. But again, this table and the previous slides are intended to show the potential scale of impact, and what we're working to organize our thinking about how we can minimize the potential impact that exists. So on the next slide, we lay out a series of strategies and examples of actions that can be taken over the course of the 25-year time horizon that can function to minimize environmental impacts and enhance conservation opportunities as projects move forward. And rather than going through this item by item, I'd simply point out that the outreach and coordination strategy is one that the MPO in particular, and especially during the long-range transportation planning process, is particularly well suited to really embrace and help lead on, and that's where we've focused much of our time and energy. Avoidance and mitigation strategies are more commonly advanced during the specific project development process and are actions that are more appropriate to be taken by project sponsors and other stakeholders working at that project level. And then land management and protection and preservation strategies are opportunities or strategies that can be advanced really at any time and are probably best advanced in the context of local, regional, and statewide planning as it relates to land use and zoning and future comprehensive planning that may be taking place at the community level. We will elaborate on each of these strategies and examples in the policy brief. And lastly, we have pulled together 4 recommended actions that are likely to be included in the policy brief and brought to you and to the Transportation Policy Board as part of the draft plan for your consideration, where we think it will be important to set ambitious environmental goals as part of the planning process and to track performance against those goals over the course of the life of the plan. We think it's important to prioritize investments that have minimal impact and or that have enhancement opportunities to support conservation and preservation goals. We think it'll be important to implement a formalized PEL framework to link regional planning and transportation project development more closely going forward. And lastly, we think it will be very valuable to expand the purpose of our regional environmental roundtable that we are convening to enlist their support in establishing a shared regional vision for conservation and preservation priorities. And with that, I'll land on the last slide, which is that a number of the environmental data sets that we've shown and highlighted in this series of slides today are available at GNRC's data portal. So I'd encourage you, if there are specific data sets that you're interested in playing with and learning more about, to navigate there on your time and explore them there. And I also want to also acknowledge the significant assistance and support of Max Baker and his team in the research and analytics shop in pulling all this information together to be able to share with you. And with that, Sean or Glenn, if there's a moment to field any hot questions, I'm happy to do that. Or if you feel like we need to move forward, whatever is most appropriate from your perspective.
No, absolutely, Ben. If anyone has any questions or follow-ups for Ben, feel free to do those at this time. All right, Ben, well, thank you for all that information. That was a lot to take in. I'm sure we will have some follow-ups later on. With that, we will move on to the social equity portion of this presentation, and I'll turn it over to Shelley Hazel to get us started with that one.
Thanks, Glenn. We are developing a policy brief similar to the environmental one that explores equity in the region to help us ensure that we make decisions that are informed and help us make the region more equitable. As part of the process, we're developing this brief. We've reviewed a lot of the efforts that our peers have done from around the country and come up with a strategy that builds off of their best practices. This presentation is an overview of the brief, so you can see that we'll be going through demographics, some access to opportunity, some key regional trends and findings, and then conclude with some likely recommendations. You can go to the next slide, Sean. Talk a little bit about why this topic matters. I think there are numerous reasons, of course, but we want to ensure that all residents have access to jobs, education, recreation, healthcare, and transportation. More equitable regions are more competitive regions. More equitable communities provide better quality of life for all residents. And of course, there are federal requirements. You can go to the next slide, Sean. Before we go further and dive into some of the data, I just thought it's kind of important to talk about some of the context that the region's in, that we have faced some key challenges, that our population is growing, that we have a diverse, dispersed development pattern, there's an increasing cost of housing, we have limited transportation options, and of course, COVID-19. Next slide. As I mentioned, there are federal requirements. These are the four central ones to this discussion. Of course, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, executive orders that talk about environmental justice and limited English proficiency, and of course the ADA. Next slide. So building on those federal regulations, GNRC's identified these 9 populations as vulnerable. And this list is really consistent with the peers that we looked into. Next slide. And you can see on this slide how those 9 relate to the 4 federal regulations that we discussed. You can go to the next slide. Diving in a bit to these vulnerable populations, these are the percentage of these vulnerable populations in the region. So you can see that, racial minorities are making up almost a quarter of our population, and those over 65, the next largest, coming in at 12%. Next slide looks at the change in the percent of population, vulnerable populations. The average the population growth for the region over this time period is 16%. So you can see that 5 of these groups are outpacing the regional growth rate, with the senior population really leading the way at 40% and ethnic minorities coming in closely behind at 36%. Next slide. Thought before we move forward and dive into the data, we need to clarify some language. We are using degrees of vulnerability. So DOV, it's an index that takes those 9 vulnerable populations. And then the vulnerable area is where those vulnerable populations are above the regional average. So if you have a block group of seniors that is above the 12.4 that is the regional average, that would be considered a vulnerable area for seniors. And then the highly vulnerable area is where an area that has 6 or more of those degrees of vulnerability. So if they score above average on 6, whether it's seniors, racial minorities, et cetera, of the 9, we are considering those highly vulnerable areas are HVAs. With that, I think I'm turning things over to Carson. She's pulled together a lot of great data that dives into this a little bit more.
Hello, everyone. So, as Shelley said, we evaluated each population as it compares to the regional average, and we did this at the census block group level. And it's important to note that we're comparing the proportions. Or the
I don't know about anybody else, but I can hardly hear her.
Me too.
So, did any better? Worse?
Barely.
I can just really, really speak loudly. Is this better?
A little, but still, I mean, I'm gonna have to crank up my volume here. I mean, this is the first time I've had anybody that I've had a problem hearing.
I was having some computer issues earlier, so not super surprised. I guess I will just really try and yell. But so we evaluated the proportion of each of these populations, or the percent of that population compared to the regional average. So it doesn't always line up with the density, such as the blue dots shown in this map, which is the actual number of seniors. But these orange areas are highlighting block groups where the proportion of seniors is much higher. So, I mean, in Davidson, there's just generally more people, so there might be more seniors. But as a proportion of the population, it's much higher in these orange areas. And altogether, these orange areas represent over half of all of the seniors in the region, which is pretty dispersed. Going to the next slide, we're looking at racial minorities, or the non-white population, and it's definitely more concentrated in urban areas, which is more consistent with the density of the population. And about 3/4 of the entire region's minorities are represented just in these orange areas. Similar to racial minority, the ethnic minority population, which is Hispanic and Latino, are more concentrated in certain specific areas throughout the region. And again, about 3/4 of the Hispanic population is represented just in these orange areas. The disabled population is a little more dispersed throughout the region, similar to seniors, with much of the population actually living in the counties surrounding Davidson, and over half of the population living in these areas. Single mother households are pretty dispersed throughout the region. I just want to say we evaluate this population because of it being a single income household, and it definitely makes it more difficult to care for children, or more vulnerable to cost of living increases. And it's pretty widespread throughout the region. And interestingly, on the next slide, there are quite a few concentrations of carless households in the surrounding counties, not just in the urban core areas, meaning these people may have a harder time commuting to work to downtown, or just getting around the region. There are about 30,000 carless households in the region, and 23,000 of those, or 80%, are represented in these orange areas. So it's a significant population. Limited English households are concentrated similar to the racial and ethnic minority areas, where there's likely more immigrants, and there's representing 90% of all of the limited English households in the region. Unemployment is pretty scattered throughout the region, and again, 3/4 of it is represented by these orange areas. Definitely, to me, there's some larger areas that are in the surrounding counties. And finally, poverty is relatively scattered throughout the region, probably with the exception of Williamson County, and about 3/4 of the families in poverty are represented by these orange areas. So all of those populations and areas that we just went through and evaluated are shown here in a sort of composite. So anything that was orange is now being graded on how many orange areas did it meet. Kind of how Shelley said, if it was a 0 to 9 on being above average for every 9 of those populations. 9 being the most vulnerable, as it has a higher than average concentration of all of those populations. And we decided to classify highly vulnerable areas, or those that received a score of at least 6 or more. It really helps us just evaluate vulnerable hotspots, meeting more of the populations that we want to serve. And 20% of all of the region's block groups were classified as highly vulnerable. And these highly vulnerable areas, or you might see them called HVAs, represent only about 17% of the region's total population. And I want you to note this 17% as we go through some variables and analysis, because if proportions are higher than this representative population, then things are disproportionately happening in that area compared to what they actually represent. And we made it easier to evaluate by lumping together sort of clusters of block groups based on their geography of these highly vulnerable areas by neighborhood within Davidson County or the surrounding cities throughout the region, thus creating 21 highly vulnerable area clusters. This is more of a table for reference if you're interested in these specific areas, but it shows the profile of the specific populations that each highly vulnerable area has a high concentration of. So it takes the block group with the highest score in that kind of cluster and breaks it down by which populations it's meeting. Some of them meeting all of them, some of them meeting 6 of them, and it's just interesting to see who's living there. And again, just highlighting that we are evaluating the proportions of these populations. So in the case of each population, with the exception of seniors, because their distribution is really dispersed, the proportion of these populations are disproportionately higher in vulnerable areas than the MPO region. So for example, while 24% of the region is non-white, half of the population living in these highly vulnerable areas are non-white. And we can also compare the change that occurred in these areas versus the region since 2010. The region is higher for these bar changes in the blue because the raw numbers themselves are higher. So the population could have increased by 100,000 people. Obviously, the vulnerable areas are a smaller area, so they're not going to increase by as many people. But for both the region and the HVAs, almost all of these populations are increasing. What's really interesting to note are these light orange boxes that I've highlighted. They might be a little hard to read, but you can definitely look at these later. That while the region as a whole increased in the non-white population by 21%, a third of that 21% occurred in these HVAs. So a lot of the increases that are happening are really targeted in these areas. Some other dramatic figures are that about 40% of the increase in limited English households occurred in these HVAs, and half of the increase in poverty in the region occurred in these highly vulnerable areas. So these are very disproportionately vulnerable hotspots. And another interesting note is that we want a larger decrease in unemployment. So you want a larger bar for that. And following the recession since 2010, the region has recovered from unemployment with a decrease of almost 30%. But in these highly vulnerable areas, they've only recovered with a decrease of about 6%. So there's many people still very much affected by the recession, even so many years ago. So now we're going to go over access to opportunities. And right now, we only really had time to do employment and transportation. We see those as probably the priorities for our region. But in the brief, we plan to go more into healthcare and education and other quality of life amenities that are very important to be accessible. But starting with employment, this is a map just showing where jobs are available in relation to the HBAs, which are in light gray. It's no surprise that many of the jobs are concentrated in downtown Nashville and other urban pockets. So if they were to work in the area in which they live, there's about 18% of the region's jobs in these areas, which is close to that representative population of 17%. But if we look at where these people are actually working, and not just the jobs that are located next to them, this map on the next slide shows where the jobs are, where people who live in the HBAs actually work. So those yellow areas really are only concentrated in downtown Nashville. So many of the majority of the HBA's population have to commute downtown, or they're possibly commuting outside of the MPO region. So while 18% of the region's jobs are within the region in these areas, only 9% of the region's jobs are actually held by a resident in this region. So it's just showing the distribution of the jobs where people are actually living and working. And we wanted to see how accessible that is to transit stops. It's important to note that being in proximity to a transit stop doesn't mean that the route necessarily serves where you need to go, and definitely might not serve it at a convenient commute time. But it's just interesting to note that over half of the jobs held by HVA residents are within a half mile to a transit stop. So they're at least close to stops and may be able to use transit. We wanted to dig a bit further into commute times and patterns. So this shows the roadway travel time bands of the PM or afternoon commute across the region in a car. So this is just for car commuters. And the average commute time across the MPO is 27 minutes. So we used 30 minutes as a reasonable kind of commute cutoff. All of Davidson and some like interstate spokes are within that 30-minute commute time band, and all but 6 of the HVA clusters are within that 30 minutes by car. But if we look at this, considering transit travel times on the next slide, it's dramatically decreased. Remembering that many of these highly vulnerable areas are carless households and likely rely the most on transit. However, transit service may not even reach them or may create a commute upwards of 2 hours, and that's not even including the time it takes to wait for the bus. So it's just a very dramatic look at how people are moving around the region. So now, again, looking at the actual density of the infrastructure, many of the highly vulnerable areas have a relatively high transit stop density, especially concentrated in those areas closer to the urban core and like the WeGo station downtown. But we just wanted to look at each type of infrastructure. So similarly for sidewalks on the next slide, concentrated mainly in those urban core areas with higher block densities, more walkable. Similar trend for bike lanes, a little bit more of a decrease as we go down the curve there. And similar trend for greenways and trails, but with Franklin jumping to the top, they have a pretty robust trail network down there. And this composite just shows the share of each of those walkable infrastructure densities in each area and how they compare to one another. And in summary, the top 3 of each density are bolded, and the rows are highlighting which ones are meeting the most of those criteria. And it shows that these close urban core vulnerable areas are actually pretty well served by transit and walkable infrastructure density, but just take into account that that's just representative of the density. That doesn't represent the condition, reliability, and other factors, of course, that go into active transportation. And then we wanted to see how well we are serving each population concentration and not just the collective highly vulnerable areas. So this is transit density broken out by vulnerable population in the above average in the blue, and the below average areas are not very concentrated areas. And we're actually serving them better than the lower concentration areas, with the exception of senior and disabled populations. There's higher transit density stops in non-white or high concentrations of non-white areas versus not as high concentrations. And there's a similar trend for sidewalks, with the exception of seniors and disabled, and a similar trend for bike lane density, similar trend for trail density, and finally a little composite at the end here. So again, we do serve the above average populations, typically better than their counterparts with just the density of infrastructure, with the exception of seniors and disabled, which is interesting because those are 2 populations that are actually more likely to need that dense and accessible transit and sidewalks because they may have barriers to access driving a car. So then we looked at transit route distribution across the region and not just stop density, as well as the high frequency routes. So headway is the amount of time you are waiting for the next bus, and we identified high frequency being a 15 to 20 minute headway or 3 to 4 buses per hour. Across the region, the average headway, lowest headway across all peak hours is actually 42 minutes, so it's not really low. But it's crucial that these services are on schedule or on time because it may affect someone's trip by upwards of an hour just to wait for the following bus. And so we wanted to start looking at how some of these trip variables possibly correlate with each other. So here on the vertical axis is the percent of households without cars. So as it goes up, there are more carless households. And the horizontal axis is actually percent of workers with a short commute, short being under the average of 30 minutes. So as you go to the right, you're actually getting more workers with a short commute. And we use the MPO averages as kind of a threshold. And it's really interesting that most of these highly vulnerable areas are above average for both variables, meaning that there's higher concentrations of not having a car, so probably using transit, but they actually have more people with short commutes. So again, that isn't to say that the transit or other mode they use to work is a short commute, but it actually may be possibly an indication that the short commute is out of necessity. So they can only live within certain transit networks and they aren't able to access further jobs or the higher paying jobs. And it also, again, doesn't take into account the headway time, it's just the actual trip time. So the next slide, we wanted to look at that headway time. And again, out of that necessity, this shows that the average lowest headway for each vulnerable area in comparison to those carless households. And very interesting, almost all of the HVAs are above average for the amount of time they have to wait for the bus while also being the ones probably in most need of transit. And like I said on this previous slide, this commute time doesn't include that amount of time you wait for the bus, it's just the bus trip. So while maybe a larger share of these workers have a shorter commute, their overall commute can probably be upwards of an hour and a half when including the headway. And if they miss that bus, there's definitely no way of getting to work on time, and that definitely decreases the access to higher paying jobs or further jobs that you are able to work at. So then we decided to look at the cost of transportation, and looking at the cost of living and other factors, this shows all of the highly vulnerable areas are pretty much above the regional average of spending transportation as a percent of their income. So many of these areas are cost burdened. Even those that are closer to the urban core and are closer in access, their incomes are so low that they're spending disproportionately more on transportation. And we can't talk about transportation without talking about housing. So similar trend for housing, a little more market variability. So there are some red areas popping up outside of the HVAs, but those areas may be cost burdened. They aren't the most vulnerable of populations that are really affected by cost of living increases. But again, all of the HVAs pretty much are above that regional average for housing costs. And here's a composite of housing and transportation costs together. So while these HVAs may not spend an actually large raw amount on housing or transportation, or maybe in closer proximity, such as North Nashville, they're disproportionately affected by cost or cost increases, spending upwards of 80% on their income just to live. And this next chart is that same data broken out by monthly cost into a bar graph. And you can really see the difference in what that makes in disposable income between the bars and dots of each of these areas. So how much they have to spend on food and food access, those problems, as well as contributing to our economy, making the economy flourish. And it's really dramatic to see the differences in costs as well, all the way up to, Williamson County with, while they spend so much more, they have a lot more to spend. So it's interesting. And we've seen some of these before, and we've just overlaid the highly vulnerable areas with these crash corridors. And we've talked about this before, that high crash areas are definitely concentrated at choke points and interstates. Coincidentally, these highly vulnerable areas are overlaid with a lot of those high crash corridors. And the next slide shows which of those crashes were fatal or serious injuries. And again, with these vulnerable populations, some of them being disabled or possibly being pedestrians, they're definitely more likely to get seriously hurt. The next slide shows truck crashes, which are more damaging, definitely affect, the commute times or traffic in an area when they happen. And they're pretty spread out throughout the region, but concentrated in a couple of our highly vulnerable areas. And the next one shows those non-motorized crashes or pedestrian and non-motorized users that are being affected. But the hard-hitting table here on the next slide is showing that these are disproportionately higher in the highly vulnerable areas. So remember that 17% that I brought up earlier, they only represent 17% of the whole region. Area-wise, that's only 6% of the whole region in these clusters. However, all of their crashes, specifically non-motorized, are much higher than their share of the area or share of their population. So many more people are being hurt in these areas by crashes, especially non-motorized, because of carless households and access issues due to all of these factors. And that was a lot of data, but I'm going to pass it along to Shelley to kind of sum it up for you.
Thanks, Carson. I think we had one question about transit and whether that was fixed route or if paratransit was included. I don't know if you want to address that before we go forward.
We didn't include paratransit because it's not very consistent with kind of the measures that we were doing, but we included all the express services and like RTA networks, but we did not include paratransit.
Thanks. There's still a lot of exploration that we want to do. I think Carson mentioned that we want to look at education facilities, healthcare facilities, et cetera. And I'm sure you all will have like a ton of recommendations for us too and suggestions on things that we should be looking at. But we did come up with a few key findings from the data that was just presented. And that's that the region's population is growing, it's aging, and it's diversifying, that these vulnerable areas are disproportionately affected by lack of access, high transportation costs, and poor safety. And of course, multimodal infrastructure may be available, but it isn't always reliable or safe. Next slide, Sean. The brief will identify actions for the region to take. These are the likely strategies that we'll touch on, but we want to prioritize equity and access to opportunity in all decision making, improve and expand the transit system, implement complete streets, and ensure that our outreach and engagement really reaches into these highly vulnerable areas, as well as all of the communities. Next slide. And finally, you can find a lot of this data on the dashboards. I think there's another link that we can share too that has some of these graphs. I think that's it. If there's any questions.
Thanks, Shelley and Carson. Are there any follow-up questions or clarifying questions for them? Great. Hearing none, we'll move on to the next informational item. And Sean will get us started on roadway safety performance targets.
Thank you, Glenn. Excuse me. I'll just provide a quick background on this topic and turn it over to Ashley Reeves. But just to continue off of our discussion on the annual safety performance target setting, I think in February is where we kind of left off with this conversation. There was, as part of our annual support for adoption of the safety performance measure targets, as you can remember, in the previous years, we've supported the statewide targets, but there was some concerns with continuing to support the state targets, given that there was an increase in fatalities as part of those state targets. And so I believe it was in February that we committed to setting MPO targets for safety as part of the RTP process. And so today we wanted to kind of kick off that discussion and provide you with a couple of options on performance measure targets for particularly traffic fatalities that range from more the least aggressive to more aggressive options that would occur over the life of the regional transportation plan cycle, so out to 2045. And I think with the objective, I think, with presenting these to you all is to first get your feedback so that we can begin to narrow down these options to a more manageable list. I think we'll present 5 options total today. But ultimately, I think where we want to go is by next month, we want to be working towards the adoption of a target and something that you guys are that the TCC is on board with to recommend to the Transportation Policy Board by the mid-September meeting. So, just the background, the national safety goal is to achieve a significant reduction in traffic fatalities and serious injuries. There's a number of planning activities, both at the state, federal, local level, and regional level. We are very involved in the annual target setting process for the 5 federally required measures. But as I mentioned today, we'll focus particularly on traffic fatalities. Just a quick overview to emphasize, when it comes to roadway safety planning, there's commonly 4 E's emphasized: engineering, education, enforcement, and emergency response. And I just want to point out that as a result of those 4 E's, that there are roles and responsibilities across all levels of government, and whether it's more on the engineering side that the MPO is involved with, as well as locals, TDOT, and Federal Highway and Transit Administrations. There's education components, and then there's enforcement components that are more specific to state and local agencies through highway patrol or local police departments. Similarly with emergency response, more targeted towards some of the traffic incident management efforts that are in place, or fire emergency response services at the local level. So a quick overview of the options. We've identified 5. The first option being more of what's been approved in previous years. So that the first one being the support the state. So this would just be the annual MPO adoption of the state targets. And then 2 through 5 are where we've kind of identified some different options for you to consider. Number 2 would be to cap fatalities. And we've looked at the 5-year rolling average, which is 197 traffic fatalities on a rolling basis over the past 5 years. And the idea would be to not exceed that baseline moving forward. Number 3 would be the 1% annual reduction. And so this would be an average or an annual decrease in fatalities by 1%. Year after year, so compounding out to 2045. Number 4 would be a 50% overall reduction. So that would be overall reduction between now and 2045. And then a vision 0, or a what we would term our greatest reduction, which is a 16% annual decrease year after year out to 2045. And we term that greatest reduction because of looking at past historical trends, and the greatest reduction year upon year was a 16% decrease in fatalities. And so we used that as a framework for kind of the most aggressive decrease moving out into the 2045 plan horizon. So with that, I will turn it over to Ashley, and she will take you through those options and clarify some of the numbers and showcase how they vary against one another.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. Okay, so we are looking at a table of 5 options that we initially took a look at, plus the option of supporting the state's targets. And one distinction I want to make is the state's baseline was 1,022 fatalities, and their proposed target for 2016 to 2020 was 1,043. They don't forecast out targets to 2045, just the next year. I want to explain a little bit of that increase. The state's targets are established using the rate of fatalities, and there is a declining fatality rate based on the trend, but the actual number of fatalities is increasing, and the VMT is increasing even faster, so that the number, faster than the number of fatalities. So when they use the fatality rate to back calculate their target for fatalities, the target typically increases. The difference is the proposed options we are presenting are looking at the number of fatalities and then using our forecasted VMT for 2045 to calculate that. This way, it keeps the number of fatalities constant or declining while still allowing VMT to increase. The options we are currently proposing are, as Sean said, one, fatalities, meaning we have increase, decrease. Then we have one annual reduction, which ends up being a proposed target of 52 fatalities by the year 2040. That basically equivalent to an average annual number of 180 fatalities, and that would ultimately lead to saving over 6 additional lives by reducing it 1% annually. Then we look at the 50% overall reduction. That would be reducing that baseline cap 197 divided by 2, getting us to 100 or a little less than 100 fatalities by the year 2045. That would be an average annual number of 141 fatalities per year, and that would basically equivalent to saving over 1,400 additional lives. And then if we look at the more aggressive Vision Zero, or the greatest reduction we've ever seen in history, we've seen a 16% reduction in fatalities in 1 year before. And if we adopted that target, it would result in about 2 fatalities by the year 2045, with an average annual number of 39, and it would save an additional approximately 5,000 lives. We would like to use the same approach on the other safety performance management measures, such as the number of serious injuries and non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries, and then taking that number to back calculate the serious injury rate. And if Sean wants to go to the next slide, I'll show how those different targets span out over time. So what you're looking at now is if we kept it at the cap, so no more, no less. And so we're looking at 197 as our target for 2045. And if you click next, we're looking at the 1% annual reduction, and that gets us at a target of 152 by 2045. If you hit the next one, we're looking at the 50% overall reduction in fatalities by the year 2045, and we're just under 100. And if we want to be a lot more aggressive, we can look at the Vision Zero, and that gets us down to 2 fatalities by the year 2045. And I'm going to turn it over to Sean to see if we have time to take any questions or initial reactions.
Thanks, Ashley. And so we wanted to get these options presented to you today for your consideration. The idea would be to further narrow down the number of options and to ultimately identify a recommended target for the Transportation Policy Board. But if there's any initial feedback, questions, or comments, we can take those.
Hey, Sean, just so everybody understands the penalty for not achieving our targets. Can you talk a little bit about that, or is that all? I know there's a lot of concern about people having a set target when you don't reach it, we're going to get in trouble, but it's not necessarily the case. Can you talk about the penalty for not achieving these targets?
Sure. I think you had a little bit of that, Michael, but I think Michael was saying the what is the penalty for not achieving the safety targets that we set for ourselves, and the NPO, the restrictions or the penalties related to not achieving your targets are specific to the Highway Safety Improvement Program, or HSIP, and the NPO doesn't program any of the HSIP money that's prioritized by TDOT. And so there's no direct impact to us related to the HSIP, just because we don't prioritize the use of those funds. But I think one other thing to note is that there are a lot of safety projects that we are advancing into other funding sources, like this STBG funds that are funding, safety improvement projects, even though it's HSIP funding.
Well, one of the things I want to make clear, I forgot it was a bit spotty. I think everybody seems to be right now, but basically, if we have achieved these targets, we said, the state would be permitted to flex the safety money away from safety program, which means much of the penalty, it's a good decision to keep that safety money on safety projects. I'd argue, even if you are achieving your targets, then ultimately that's you lose the flexibility of being able to flex that money to other types of projects.
Thanks, Sean. Are there any other questions for Sean or Ashley regarding the safety performance targets? Thank you. With that, we'll move on to the next item, which is the 2045 RTP goal weights, and Daniel Caparella will lead us on that one.
Thanks, Glenn. If we could move to the next slide after this one. All right, so back in December and January, the TCC and the TPB voted to support the RTP policy framework, which includes goals, objectives, and performance measures. And as you all know, these goals guide investment in the regional transportation plan and are the foundation for what we hope to accomplish with projects submitted. Next slide, please. And throughout the last couple of weeks following the county workshops, we've asked you to weight these goals in order of importance using a pairwise exercise from a program called Decision Lens. And these weights will be used in our project evaluation to score projects based on which goals you all deemed the most important. And so, for example, the exercise asked you to weight the importance of improving safety against maintaining state of good repair on a scale from equal to extremely more important. And Sean, if you can move to the next slide. So these are the results thus far. Thank you to those of you who have completed the exercise. We've had 16 responses so far, and the overwhelming majority of you weighted improving safety as the most important goal, with that at around 33%. And then following that with congestion around 19.6%, state of good repair at 19.5%, economic opportunity at 11.3%, minimizing disruptive impacts at 9.5%, and then finally aligning with policies and plans at 6.8%. So we'd like everyone to take this by August 7th, the end of the week. And I know some of you have had issues with registering, so I'll get on the phone with the support team at Decision Lens and figure that out this afternoon. But please shoot me an email if you have any issues, and I'd be to help you out. And with that, I'll hand it back to Sean.
Thank you, Daniel. That was a great overview. And the only thing that I would add is that we'll be working with the Transportation Policy Board members to try and get them to complete the same exercise so that we have additional inputs into these goal weights, both the TCC and the TPB. And any other stakeholders that are participating in this process. So appreciate your participation.
Thanks, Daniel and Sean. Are there any clarifying questions for either of them on these initial results? Hearing none, we'll move on to the regular reports. For the chair's report, I think the Power of 10 conference is coming up next week, Thursday, August the 13th from 9 until noon. So you may want to look for that if you would like to register for it. And also, during the presentation, I think we had some audio issues. So if anyone had a question that didn't get heard or didn't get an answer to a question, feel free to email Sean. I'm sure they can get you whatever you need there. And that is all that I have, so we'll move on to staff reports.
Thanks, Glenn. Just a couple of reminders for folks. We appreciate your participation in the Round 1 county workshops. We were able to meet with each county and review a lot of the details of the candidate projects, including verifying a number of items related to cost estimates, project termini, local funding availability, desired timelines and schedules. And we look forward to kicking off the Round 2 workshops. We would just want to emphasize that there are still we had some action items related to gathering some of the further details on some of those candidate projects. And so we want to get those action items solidified by the end of the week would be ideal. Most of you have responded to that follow-up email. There's a couple of communities that I think that we're still awaiting updates on. And so if you could just try and wrap those up by the end of the week, we would greatly appreciate it. And it would allow us to kind of take the next step forward and be sure that once we kick off the evaluation of these projects, that we have the appropriate level of detail and information on your projects.
Hey, this is Josh Suddeth over in Sumner County. On the awaiting updates there for us, and I know Bill's not here for Gallatin. Is that related to the net corridor extension there, where the potential hook into 31E? Is that what you guys are waiting on for us?
Yeah, that's correct, Josh. I think you got us everything else.
Okay, all right. And I've Jonathan, but I'm gonna send you an email today to see if we can get something set up just to talk that through.
Appreciate that. And then just a preview of the Round 2 workshops. We're targeting mid-August to the end of August for those. We would like to keep the same time, try and aim for 10 in the morning for these, and hopefully we won't need the full 2 hours to get through these, but if we could try and plan around those same windows. And the focus will be primarily on the preliminary results of the project evaluation, and then as part of that, staff's analysis of projects to identify potential changes in scope or improvements to incorporate or consider as part of the project. And the last, we sent around as part of the packet just a link to the CMP file share, which includes some of the progress that we've been making on the CMP update. We've drafted 3 tech memos related to a couple of the steps of the CMP process. Step 4, the data collection and monitoring framework, the toolbox of strategies related to step 6, and also the CMP evaluation strategies related to step 8. And so if you have an opportunity to review those at your convenience, please do so. You've received, I think, updates on a lot of these topics in presentation form, but it might be helpful to kind of have it all in one tech memo so that you can see how all this fits together and has the appropriate context. And with those tech memos, just a quick update on the CMP process. We're working through those steps, and kind of the last remaining item that we'll be working on over the coming months is this programming and implementation of strategies to address congestion. And so that process is underway through the call for projects. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, I can turn this over to Jonathan to go through, but I wanted to make sure that people were aware of TDOT's Improve Act Transit Capital Grant. There's just some basic information on the grant opportunity. Jonathan, is there anything else that you want to add on top of what we have listed here?
Sure, not much. I mean, this is something that was in the Improve Act. Of course, it's open to anyone who receives, as it shows on the screen, 5307 or 5311 funds. I'm not 100% sure how long funds are allocated for. I don't know how far in the future this continues. This will now be the second cycle that we've done, but it is 75% state money and of course 25% local. I do know that John Brock, who's there listed as your contact, John Brock is going to be taking a new position outside of TDOT in the next week. So I'm not sure who your best contact is. I know that Michael Cushing is here from Multimodal on the call. I'm not saying he's your next contact, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to John in the next week or myself, and I'll make sure that gets to the right person.
Thanks, Jonathan. And the only thing I wanted to emphasize was the August 21st date. Just they're looking for, similar to the other grant opportunities, a notice of intent letter by August 21st. So I know that that's quickly approaching. If you're interested, please follow up with TDOT. And that's all I have, Glenn, on the staff report.
Thanks, Sean. Does anyone have any other business for the committee today?
Hey, Glenn, this is Sean Santaya with the Federal Highway Administration. Just to, if you guys don't mind, if I can quickly clarify the consequences associated with the safety target. It's not so much a limitation on the ability to flex that HSIP funding. It's more that it's if the state does not meet or make significant progress towards meeting their targets, then they are required to use their obligation authority in an amount equal to their HSIP apportionment for HSIP projects. So the flexibility is more on their obligation authority, not so much on the funding. Again, there's no consequences to the MPO on setting their own targets, but just kind of wanted to clarify that. I'll drop an FAQ in the chat pod, and if you guys go to the near the bottom of that, it's addressed in that FAQ.
Yeah, well, and it's not just, hopefully you guys can hear me now, this is Michael, but practically speaking, I think we're seeing the same things, that the state is going to be required to spend that money on safety projects, having demonstrated that they haven't satisfied, the safety targets. The MPO wouldn't view this as a penalty at any rate anyway. It's more of a, making sure that we're spending money according to our goals and objectives, safety being top priority. And so, until we've achieved that goal, probably not wise to defer any investments in the safety projects.
Thank you.
Yes, Michael, that was a little mumbled. I will just say, speaking from TDOT, I don't see TDOT adjusting how they set their targets. I know the Federal Highway guidance for DOTs was make it an attainable target, which TDOT has taken that very literally. So I will repeat again, though, that as far as TDOT, I don't want to go as far as say we encourage MPOs to make their own targets, but we definitely support that. And there, as you said, Sean, there are no consequences to MPOs. So personally speaking, if the MPO wants to set their own targets, I think TDOT would be in full support.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that information, and Sean. looks like we'll have a little more to look at in the upcoming months with that item. Are there any other items of other business to hear today? Great. With that, we'll adjourn to the next scheduled September 2nd, 2020 meeting. You guys have a great day.